Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Anna, for that introduction. And thank you all so much for being here this morning. It's lovely to see all of the places that you're joining us from whizzing up in the chat box. So yes, a very warm welcome to everybody to this session about the role of L1 in English medium teaching. So we're going to jump straight in by explaining what we're going to do today. We'll be looking first and answering the question, what is EMI? Then we'll be looking at the importance of L1 in EMI. The third section of the presentation will be about how we can bring the into EMI programs, and then of course we will conclude it all. So start by explaining that all of the research, the information, statistics and things, examples that we talk about today are taken from this position paper. And as you can see, there are a couple of other examples screen as well. These are such a fantastic resource, and I would really encourage, if you have time, to go onto the OU site and to download them. The address is there. Don't panic if you haven't got a pen or paper or you're not ready to screenshot. I will show this again at the end of the presentation because they really are such a great resource for us all. So we're going to start by answering the question, is EMI? In English language teaching, we love acronyms, don't we? So let's start with explaining what this one is, because it's often used in conjunction, or it's similar to and therefore a little to another acronym that you may well know, which is CLIL. So if we can look at the sort of differences of them. So the first one stands for English medium instruction, or English as the medium of instruction. They're interchangeable, it means the same thing. And CLIL, you probably also know, is content and language integrated learning. Sorry, I'm just checking. He was saying that the connection is not so great. I will carry on anyway. Sorry, because I don't know what to do about that. Okay, so English medium instruction and CLIL both are teaching a subject through the medium of English. So these are the similarities. Where they differ is the EMI concentrates just on the content. The focus is on the content. However, with CLIL, there's a focus both on the content and language that we're using, which obviously in our case is English. So let me just check, is there anything about the sound? So we are probably familiar with CLIL type lessons. These are all taken from a series called Octava. So as we see here, the content is about maths, but there's also language support there, looking at key vocabulary students might need. So the content with the language support. Also here an explicit use support for vocabulary. Of course, it doesn't just have to be maths, it can be topics of science or geography or history. So here is a definition of EMI taken from the position paper. And as we read it together, I'm just going to, sorry if I can move. There we go. As we read it together, can look and see what could be some of the main points. So, English medium instruction is a model of education in which some or all curriculum content taught in English to students who speak other languages in their homes and communities. Increasing popularity of EMI in primary and secondary schools, the area of focus for this paper, can be attributed to a desire to prepare students for EMI university courses, the high value on English as a global language of business and popular culture, and the personal enrichment associated with being able to speak more than one language. So a very inclusive definition there with some key points. So let's look at some of those key points then. The first one being that it's a model of education in which some or all curriculum content is taught in English without emphasis of language teaching as well. So it's just focusing on the content. And this is any speakers of other languages. So it could be that your class all have the same home or the home language may differ. So part of the rise in the popularity of EMI is desire to prepare students for EMI university courses. And this might be where the whole university course is taught in English or just particular subjects in it. So it's really getting our students future ready. And this rise in popularity of both EMI in language schools and at universities is really so institutions have that distinction, or it lets them stand out a bit from their rival institutions. So another reason for the popularity is the high value put on English as a global language of business and popular culture. It's reported now that there are about 380 million native speakers in the world of English, 1,500 million of second language speakers of English. So it really is becoming a global language. And I'm sure in your local context, you will know of examples of where it's used in business and in popular culture. And the last reason for the rise in popularity is the personal enrichment associated with being able to speak more than one language. So lots of reasons for English instruction to become more popular. Now, CLIL and EMI programs have around the world in many different contexts. So the context, the geographical, the social context may vary, the type of institution, and also the age of the students. And this is what this picture is illustrating, the wide range of CLIL and EMI programs can occur. We're going to look at some models of these put on the climb of starting with fewer hours of content in English, moving more hours of content in English. So the first program that you may be familiar with is that students occasionally see another subject in English class. And this is like the examples we looked at, like the maths or the science, still with the language support. And this is sometimes referred to as soft CLIL. Some primary schools start their journey of bilingual teaching by introducing 2 different classes for the same subject. For example, here, science, but of course it can be any subject, taught twice, both in the L1 and then once in English. This way, guaranteeing that students are learning the content of the topic, as well as increase hours of English that they get per week outside the traditional ELT classroom. Another model, which is sometimes referred to as hard CLIL, is when a certain subject is always only in English. Here, science, of course, it can be any other subject. We move more to the hours of English content, and this might be a model where more than one topic, so subjects, for example, here 3 are taught in English. And this may still be CLIL if there's language content involved, or it could be or EMI, depending on the program. Now, if the program is half or more subjects taught in English, this is what we call bilingual, what is started to be referred to as pure bilingual. If we see a program when all subjects in English except the national language, all subjects are taught in English except national language, this tends to happen in international schools. So this would be a mix of home students and international students. Whereas the last model we here, where all instruction is given in English, this would tend to be in schools that cater more for the expat community. So maybe students whose parents move around a lot in their jobs, which means that every few years they'll move, so they need international curriculum, and they're not going to really learn the home language of where they are, because in a few years they move again. This model would also have English lessons, but they would be English lessons similar to those taught for native speaker students. So as we see, a wide range of different programs that are still incorporating CLIL or EMI. So I thought it might be interesting for us to see any of these models fit the model that you are teaching with. And as you can see, they've all been numbered now. So if there is a model that fits with how you teach, it might be interesting in the chat box if you could type the number that closely resembles your teaching experience. Okay, so thank you. We're seeing lots of ones here. So what we would call soft CLIL. Yeah, fantastic. So lots of ones whizzing up here. So it's good to know that we're all working in similar environments. Okay, we have a 3 there. So yeah, moving more towards CLIL. So we have some 2s. Wow, we have so a 6 there. So maybe that's an international school. So nice, lots in the 1s and 2s, and then a couple right to the 6. And I think I saw a 7 whizzing past. So thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's interesting to know what our colleagues are doing. And then it means that, sorry, I'm just going to type something. I'm seeing if I can help with this. It's always good to see what our colleagues are doing so we can also maybe get some help from them. Oh, fantastic. So lots of 7s coming in now as well. Great. So like Anna explained in the introduction, in the abstract, using L1 in the English language classroom can be rather controversial. And so the next part of this presentation is about showing the best models of that, because of course L1 can be used in the English classroom and it be used really badly and inefficiently. And it can also be used extremely well and efficiently. So those are the more positive models that we're going to concentrate on. And we're going to start by looking at that, by thinking and reflecting our own attitudes towards the use of L1. Because as teachers, our own attitudes, even unconsciously, seep out into the classroom and affect our students. So there are 4 statements here, and you don't have to tell me, you don't have to type the answer. You can just reflect about it and keep that to yourself. But just think about which one really relates to you. So my students and I use the L1 class, and I believe this is wrong. B, my students and I use the L1 in the class, and I believe this is. My students and I don't use the L1 in the class, and I believe this is wrong. And my students and I don't use the L1 in the class, and I believe this is good. So you can just, oh yeah, lots of answers coming through already. Nice that you want to share. If you don't want to share, it's okay just to keep that to yourself. Wow, and we're seeing lots of A's and B's here. Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, some C's there. Depends on the students' levels. Yeah. Oh, that's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. It feels like a lot of us are B's. Again, sometimes A's, sometimes C's. It obviously depends on the students and the context. Like I said, what we're going to look at now then is how we can use it in considered best practice. So if we look at these, let's say, benefits or results, better acquisition of English, improves outcomes in other academic areas, improves engagement, motivation, supports social and emotional well-being, empowers learners for the future. And we would all agree that these are all things that we want for our learners. And interestingly, and perhaps seemingly counterintuitively, the thing with all of these benefits is using L1 in EMI programs. So we're going to look at each of these benefits in more detail. So the first benefit, that actually using on in EMI programs develops better acquisition of English. So how to learn their L1 is like this picture. It's an island, often in isolation, with no relation to anything else, any other languages. And for most of the 20th century, it's believed that we learn our L2 in a very similar. So again, as its own island, as its own entity, without any relation to any other language. However, what happened as a building on certain development and research was that in the 1970s and 80s, people realized that there was this common underlying proficiency. And Jim Cummings developed the linguistic interdependence hypothesis, in which he stated that the skills developed in L1, I'm just checking my pictures, my notes, sorry. So the skills needed to succeed in schools developed in L1 will naturally be transferred to L2 once a level of proficiency is achieved. And this is called cross-linguistic transfer. So on the surface, it might look like the two languages that our students are studying are in isolation, but actually there is this common underlying proficiency between them. What was also discovered then, if L1 was prohibited in learning, it meant that the students weren't successfully developing those skills needed to succeed at school, and therefore transferred to L2. So what actually happened was that they saw poorer results in both English language learning and in other curriculum areas. Another benefit of using L1 is that it improves outcomes in other academic areas. So this is again taken from the position paper, and it says, in studies of learners' progress in science, maths, civics, and general education development, students in bilingual programs tended to do at least as well as, and sometimes better than, their peers in English-only programs. And this is because again, they have developed those underlying cross-linguistic transfer between the two subjects. A piece of research was done. Let me check what the next slide is, sorry. A piece of research was done with Mandarin speakers in New Zealand. Sorry, someone's asked to show the previous slide. This is the previous slide. You will get a copy of the presentation, so you will be able to see them later on. So there was a group of Mandarin speakers in New Zealand, and they took part of what was called reciprocal reading piece of research, where students could discuss the text that they were going to read in English in their own language. So what happened here was that all of those thinking skills, the inferring, summarizing, predicting, were actually internalized in the students. They were much more fluid in their discussions, and therefore it made them more available to the reading. Another benefit is that it improves engagements and motivation. So here we have a classic gap fill. Research on language of instruction in groups has found that making education is associated with more children starting school, better once they are there, and improved community. So we haven't got time for you to all in the chat box, so I'm going to show you the answers. Research on language instruction in minority groups has found that making L1 education available is associated with more children starting school, better motivation once they are there, and improved community empowerment. So if you look in the position papers, there are many examples of how using L1 increased that motivation. It also supports social and emotional well-being. So here, as we see the quote, valuing learners' first language knowledge is essential to reinforce learners' cultural and personal identities. Having a sense of identity is really connected with our well-being. And language that we speak at home is argued that it's really inseparable from our communities and from our histories. And a piece of research was done with Latino students in the USA. And what researchers saw was that if their home language was prohibited in school, students were even punished for speaking it, then they ran the risk of telling students unconsciously that there was something wrong about their own identity. So here is a photo, and if you've seen some of my presentations before, you may have seen this. This is a photo of my grandmother at her first ever school. Here is my grandmother on the end. She was 8 or 9 when she started school. And this was in the Scottish Highlands in around the 1930s. So the language that all of these children spoke was Gaelic. And they waited a long time for the school to be built, the school that you see there standing outside. And when they built it, the local authority could only send an English-speaking teacher. So suddenly these children were totally immersive environment where they were only taught in English. The teacher couldn't speak any Gaelic at all. What happened was that they were punished for speaking Gaelic, and physically punished. They were smacked on the hand with rulers or smacked on their bum. Of course, no surprise, they all hated speaking English. Whenever they spoke Gaelic, even just to ask a question or at playtime, they were punished. So it's no wonder that for many years my grandma wouldn't speak English. It was only much later on in her adult life she started to use it. So as teachers, if we prohibit L1 or if we keep on punishing students for using, at best, students will see their home language as irrelevant, but at worst, they will in a negative light, therefore seeing that there's something wrong with their own identity and affecting emotional well-being. And the last benefit of using L1 is that it empowers learners for the future. When we teach primary or even secondary students, always at the back of our mind is how we can get them future ready. And you can see that all of the other advantages, we are getting them future ready. because they have better acquisition of English, better outcomes. They show more engagement and motivation, and they have emotional well-being, all of which is helping them then to succeed in the future. So how can we bring L1 into the EMI programme in this model of what we call best practice? So remembering that EMI programs happen in many different contexts, so some of these examples will be more or less relevant to your teaching situation. But we're going to start again with our love of acronyms in English language teaching. We're going to look at BICS and CULP. And you may know what these stand for. BICS stands for Basic Interpersonal Communication Skills. It's the language of the day-to-day interactions, both in the classroom and at home. In the Oxford book Show and Tell, there's lots of emphasis on this. So here you see that we have this follow me section of introducing themselves and let's go play. Do you want? Yes, please. No, thanks. About time. Also, as we move up into bright ideas, higher level, we can see also this emphasis of English in use. Those practical things that we use in the classroom. And the BICS are much easier for students and quicker than both in their L1 and in L2, probably because of repetition and context. When I was teaching in a summer school, I was teaching a student who was A1 level, maybe not even that. And yet at lunchtime once I was in my office and I heard him shout in a perfect English accent, "Hurry up, guys, you're going to be late." And I looked out the door in amazement and said, "Abdul Rahman, was that you?" And he said, "Yes." It was because every lunchtime when they'd finished their lunch, the activity leader shouted, "Hurry up, guys, you're going to be late," because they were trying to get them on the bus. And because of that, he had learned it. And also he'd learned it perfectly in context. So the BICS are generally much easier to learn. The CULP stands for Cognitive Academic Efficiency, and this is the language of academic learning, so of hypothesizing, justifying, classifying, evaluating. And this is not surprisingly harder to learn, longer to learn. And some people also argue it's impossible to learn if not taught explicitly. So in series like Big Ideas, students are asked these big questions, and this is where they hypothesize and evaluate all those CULP skills. They then have a thinking section and a talking point. And there is an argument that if students' L1 is much stronger than their English, then maybe these skills can be taught in L1 and then they will naturally be transferred into L2. If you remember, by that cross-linguistic transfer talked about earlier with the pictures of the underlying proficiency of the islands. So once the L2 gets to a certain level, they will automatically transfer those CULPs. We're going to look next at something called transition. And this is where an institution might use a program of starting in L1 and then moving slowly into more hours of English. Now, of course, some programs start 100% in L1 and finish 100% in English. This is to show an explanation. But what it allows is for students to develop those literacy skills and those CULP skills in their first language, so they feel confident with those skills before they start to struggle with L2. Another idea then is allowing this thinking the L1. And this was in the position paper, a beautiful example that happened where a teacher told their students that they could plan their assignment in L1, knowing that they would write the final version in English. And what was interesting from this research was that 3 main benefits came out of it. The first one, that the teacher was very pleasantly surprised that they were much better assignments than she had ever received in the past. Through speaking to the students, they all said that by being able to think and plan in their L1, they felt smart and they felt like real students. And the last interesting thing that came out was that many of the students had discussed it outside the classroom, the project outside the classroom, with their family, either their friends or their family. So the amount of time that they're thinking about the assignment was increased because they could do it in their L1. Now, this was used as a writing assignment. And as we can see, like Oxford Discover Futures, when there is a writing task, students are really supported in those pre-reading tasks. So here they're given a writing strategy about their audience. So this is an example of where you could use student L1 in this preparation stage, knowing that they're going to create the final thing in English. So again, another example of a writing strategy here is the mind map. Again, easily done in L1, and you can also then help and check ideas. Using Venn diagrams is a fantastic way of thinking about ideas and comparison. It could be used in L1. Now, all these examples were about writing, but we can also use this initial thinking time, planning time in other types of projects. So in Bright Ideas, I can't remember how, after however many units, there's a project that the students do. Here it's the collaborate section when they're going to choose a character to, and this may be able to be done in L1. So the planning stages, while they're making here, they're creating the different aspects, bearing in mind that their final presentation will of course be in English, but they could practice, they could write their key ideas in L1, and then you can help transfer it into English, knowing that the final presentation will be done in English, giving them all of those senses of achievement and feeling real students that the students in that piece of research felt. Another idea of bringing L1 into EMI programs is what's called TransLanguaging. And this is a recent approach to bilingual instruction that encourages multilingual learners to use all of their languages in response to each learning content. For example, we're going to look at 3 different ways of using translanguaging. The first one is that students could compare and contrast the L2 with their L1. So this might be in terms of words, phrases, or grammar structures. And this can really help students to see false friends, for example, but also to see in grammar, use a very similar structure to that, or we use this structure and it doesn't quite mean the same as it does in English. And if you speak the same language as your students L1, then this is of massive benefit for you. Another way to introduce translanguaging is that students give examples of complex words in L1. When I started teaching, we were very much encouraged to never use L1. And I was teaching in the Czech Republic, so I didn't speak Czech anyway. So it was easy for me never to use. But one of my Czech colleagues came in all harassed into the staff and said she had spent 10 minutes trying to explain the word coffin. She had explained it and she had drawn it, and in the end she acted out dying and lying on the floor, and still the students didn't know it, so she just said the word Czech. And then we discussed it, and she said, is it really that bad that I did that? We're moving more now towards that understanding that actually by explaining the complex words in L1, it actually helps our students to remember and to reinforce them. So one way we can do that is with vocabulary. Now, books like Oxford Discover give students such a beautiful interaction with new vocabulary. They see it visually, they hear it, they use perceptively before they're asked to produce it. And yet there still may be few words that it's just easier for you to explain in L1. For example, here, the word mixture, it might be easier to say it so they don't think that it's the verb of mix. So not the end of the world to use L1. A piece of research was done in both South Korea and I think that was also Spanish-speaking students in the USA. And what they were allowed to do was, during reading in English, they were allowed to ask students to explain some of the complex words. Now, again, in books like Oxford Discover, they really help the students by giving them pictures, context, helping students to guess words in context, to do pre-reading tasks, to get their schemata before. And yet there be words that students want to ask for an explanation of. And again, what happened in this research was that if the word had been explained in L1, students had a better understanding and they actually remembered them for longer. So that's another way of bringing it into the classroom. And the third way that we're going to do that is that students act out a story in L1 after listening to it in L2. So here is an example of a story, and we have the visuals to help students. They have auditory to listen to as well. We have the pre-reading tasks. They can follow along with the pictures. This is an example of a story from Bright Ideas. And then they have a post-reading task. And there's No reason that the post-reading task couldn't be students acting out the story again in L1. This helps you to see their comprehension of it. It also helps them to more interaction with that story because they're more likely to tell their families and friends the story in L1. Show and Tell also finished every unit with this very sweet story, which again is supported with visuals and the auditory. So there's no very young learners, the levels who are using Show and Tell, could not also reenact their stories. And I think young learners would particularly like this. And we've talked a lot about our attitudes to L1 and particularly our students' attitudes to it. But another group we have to bear in mind is the parents. So the parents of our students have a huge influence on them and language learning. All parents, like all of us, come with beliefs about language learning. And many parents have a very fixed attitude that using L1 doesn't help their child. And in extreme cases, they may even not want L1 at home to try to encourage their child to speak better English. So as teachers and as institutions, it's really important for us to think about how, as institutions, we can communicate the role of L1. So taking research from this position paper and explaining to parents that actually multilingualism contributes to intellectual social development. Remember, we talked about children losing their sense of identity if their L1 is banned or thought of as negative. So we can think about how we can help parents see the beauties of multilingualism. We have a saying in English. We say, if you speak 3 languages, you're trilingual. If you speak 2 languages, you're bilingual. And if you speak 1 language, you're English. That's because traditionally the English were very bad, and we still are in many cases, at learning other languages. So we encourage our parents to actually not make our students to be English, or that joke could also be translated to, I'm sure. We actually want them to see the enormous advantages and positivity of their children being multilingual. So let's look then at how we can conclude this, what conclusions we can take from this. It's time for you to remember any of the advantages of using L1 in EMI programs, and also if there's any ways that you can remember of how we can bring L1 into EMI programs. So let's do a bit of a roundup then. Using L1 in EMI programs actually develops better acquisition of English, as by using 2 languages together, we're developing those underlying language proficiencies that we saw in the diagram of the islands. Using L1 in suggested here today and in the position paper actually develop improvements in academic areas. There is no obvious link to the L1 learners, but it does in outcomes in other academic areas. We have seen some examples of how using it can encourage that engagement and motivation. If we value students' first language, then it really reinforces their personal and cultural identities, therefore supporting their social and emotional well-being. And by all of these above things, we will automatically be empowering for the future. So again, a reminder of where you can look at this position paper, find all of these examples and research to maybe reassure yourself, to change your practice, to help you talk to your institution about using L1, and also, like we mentioned, to help talk to parents of your students in L1. So if you have time, please download this position paper as well as the other and position papers on the website. And that just leaves me for the moment then to say a huge thank you for your presence and your participation in this first session. We're going to go over to the and answers section and see if there are any questions there. If you haven't had time to write your questions, you can quickly write them now, and we'll just have a look at what questions are there. So if you just bear with me for a moment as I read some of the questions. Okay, great. So thank you. There are some nice questions there. Everybody thanking me, that's great. We're just going to have a look at some of the questions then. So Yulia H asked, is it appropriate to use L1 in the process of explaining the meaning of complex abstract terms? And I would argue yes, absolutely. Partly for time saving, like I used the example of my colleague who spent 10 minutes to explain one word in English. Also because there are some complex abstract terms that even if the level of English needed for them would be way higher than our students have. And if it's a really important concept or term and we want our students to know it, then yes, using L1 guarantees that learning of that content without having to struggle with understanding the English involved in it as well. So yeah, I would say that that is a perfect example of where to use L1. And we're teaching vocabulary of very tangible things, a brush or chair or dog. It's much easier to show pictures or realia. But as we move into those more abstract ideas, then yes, definitely using L1 is a perfect example of this. Yulia asks, does this information refer to all age groups and does it work with primary students? Yes, absolutely. So as we saw, the examples were taken from Show and Tell, which is for very young learners. moving from to Bright Ideas, Oxford Discover, and Oxford Discover Futures. So yes, we can this concept with all age ranges. Again, looking at the appropriacy of it. I think I saw in the chat box you said that if we prohibit L1, we often face resistance from our students, especially at teenage levels. Primary children are sort of much more open. So if we teach the vocabulary only in English, they're much happier to accept it all. They're still at that very open cognitive stage. So it might not be needed to use as much L1 because they tend to be tangible vocabulary that we're at that age. However, there was that beautiful example of primary students retelling the story that they've just read, listened to in L1. So really looking at the age appropriacy with teenagers, if they're starting to get stressed or frustrated about not understanding a concept in English, then of course using L1 appropriate there. Also, I have experienced myself when I've set students tasks. I once did a project where students had to, using magazines, had to create the most complex family tree that they could, with hilarious connections between all the characters. It is such a difference when students were allowed to do the initial sort of researching and planning in their L1 and then presenting in English. If they weren't allowed to use any of their L1, they came up with much more complex storylines and a sense of, I guess, pride and ownership of that project was much bigger when they used L1. So yes, depending on the age range, thinking about the appropriacy of how much you would use and when you would use it. Again, somebody's just asked, is it appropriate for use of upper intermediate and advanced learners? Again, depending on the context. If they're very complex concepts, then yes. At that level, they would have, I'm sure, already developed all their CALP skills in their first language. That proficiency of English, they probably are already automatically being transferred over. So they may well be able to hypothesize and to evaluate and to justify in English. However, if you do have the benefit of having the same L1 as your students, then yes, it certainly wouldn't harm if there is a very complex concept, that you want to explain. I used to work with a teacher actually in the Czech Republic again, who, as a succinct way of checking the difference between false friends, she would ask for the students to say the word in Czech. And I said, oh, but I can't do that because I don't speak Czech. And she said, you can, because if you explain the word to them in English and then ask, how would you say this in Czech? If the whole class say the same word, it's likely that they understood it. If you're getting, and then I would go and check with my colleague afterwards, is that the right word? If you're getting lots of different words, then they probably haven't understood the concept. Yeah, so Lydia's asked this question: can the use of L1 discourage from learning English? From all the research that we're seeing, it actually doesn't. That's why it has counterintuitive feel to it, but actually by using L1 in specific contexts, that's an important thing to remember here, it actually encourages them English, as well as all the other benefits we saw, so of achieving different academic areas. But yes, rather counterintuitively, using L1 actually results in better English language acquisition. Okay, so I think I've answered all of the questions that were there. Thank you so much for being here, for participating. It's a pleasure to see all your names flash up in the chat box, to see all your answers and questions. I will be here for a while over the break, and I'll listen to Erica's presentation. So if any more questions do come up, then I could at least type in the chat box. But if not, that just leaves me to, again, thank you so much, and to say it's probably time for you to go and get a cup of tea or water or something. And I'm sure Anna will tell us now when the timing is for the next session. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ushapa, for the brilliant presentation. Now we are going to have a short break. During the break, it's going to be roughly about 10-12 minutes. During the break, feel free to stand up, stretch,